Hello and welcome to the 2021 OGE Form 450 review exercise. Today we'll be looking at a form filed by a Director of Lab Safety. Good morning, I'm Patrick Shepard. I'm a Senior Instructor here at the Institute for Ethics and Government, and I'm very pleased to be joined today by Cheryl Kane-Piasecki. Welcome, Cheryl.
Thanks very much, Patrick. It's nice to be with everyone.
Yes, it's great to see everyone. We hope you're staying safe and healthy. We have a lot of exercise to get into, so I think we're going to flip over to the slide deck and get started. So when we're talking about confidential financial disclosure, we really want to focus on its purpose. And in this system, that purpose is singular, and it is to prevent conflicts of interest. You may be familiar with the public system, which has a disclosure and transparency element. That element's not present in the system of confidential financial disclosure. So we're really focusing solely on preventing conflicts of interest. And you'll see this throughout the program. When you look at the definition of filer, it's based on a risk assessment by your agency about who has the greatest risk for conflicts. If you look at the flexibilities in the form, with OGE's permission, you can change the instructions, the information you gather, and even the form itself if you need different information to prevent conflicts of interest. So when we're thinking about confidential financial disclosure reporting and review, the only thing we're thinking about is preventing conflicts of interest. So the question is, what is a conflict of interest? And in short, it is an intersection between government work and financial holdings. So it's a nexus between the duties and responsibilities of an individual employee and the holdings and other interests that they've disclosed on the form. So as you are thinking about reviewing reforms, as you're looking at reports, you want to look for any nexus between the duties and responsibilities of the position and the holdings reported on the forms. So in the case of, for example, a contracting officer, if they were asked to serve on a source selection and one of the bidders was a company in which they own stock, that would be a nexus that could potentially be a financial conflict of interest. So we're looking for that intersection between duties and holdings. It's really important to know what you're certifying to as a review and certifying official. And so we have the certification statement right here on the form, and it says, on the basis of the information contained in this report, I conclude that the filer is in compliance with applicable laws and regulations. So the question here becomes, what do we mean by laws and regulations? The primary authority, the one we see most often, is 18 U.S.C. Section 208, which is the Criminal Conflict of Interest Statute, and this deals with financial conflicts of interest. If you're new to this and you're not familiar with what Section 208 covers, if you've never heard of it before, we have a number of classes in the Institute for Ethics and Government that can help you get up to speed with the elements of Section 208. We're not just talking about financial conflicts of interest, however. We're also concerned with Subpart E of the Standards of Conduct, which covers impartiality. So these are situations where there's not necessarily a financial conflict of interest, but there may be the appearance of a conflict or an appearance of partiality. So often we'd see this, for example, with a continuing relationship with a former employer that may be reported on a new entrant report. We also want to think about the misuse of position regulations in Subpart G of the standards. This covers all kinds of misuse, from simply using public office for private gain to misuse of non-public information to endorsements. And we're primarily concerned with this when we're looking at some of the outside activities and positions that may be reported on the form. And finally, when we get to Part 5 of the form, we're going to want to be conversant in the gifts regulations in Subpart B of the standards. And the reason for this is because our filers are required to report certain gifts from outside sources, and we want to ensure that those gifts have been accepted in accordance with the provisions in Subpart B. We'll talk a little bit about the review process itself and sort of what you ought to be doing as a reviewer. And the question that always animates my technical review of OGE Forms 450 is, do I have the information I need to determine affirmatively for each entry that either there is a potential for conflict here and there are steps we can take to avoid that, or there is no possibility for conflict. So if you look at an entry and it's ambiguous, you don't have sufficient information to definitively that there is a possibility for conflict or definitely not, then you need to gather more information. And as you do that, it's very important that you document. So keep good reviewers' notes. If you have back and forth with filers, which is often necessary, it's very typical that you have to go ask a question or two. Make sure you keep good records of those interactions. Where you make substantive determinations, document the basis for these determinations. And finally, where you do find potential for conflict of interest, make sure the employee is very clearly aware of the steps he or she needs to take to prevent those conflicts of interest. And that can take the form of a cautionary memo, which is a guidance document to the employee, or in some cases, maybe you want to do a formal ethics agreement where the employee commits in writing to taking certain steps to avoid conflicts of interest. But the most important thing here is to document. And the reason being that it's possible someone will come behind you, maybe because there's been a potential criminal violation or an OGE program review, and they'll want to be able to understand what your review entailed and how you came to the determinations you made. If you get nothing else out of this course, we will have been successful if all we do is let you know that the Confidential Financial Disclosure Guide exists and is available for your use. It's on the OGE website. We'll put a link on the course page so you can find it easily. This is really the shop manual for reviewing OGE Forms 450. If you have questions about particular entries, how to report them, how to do a conflicts analysis, this document is the guide that will help you through that work. We also have a lot of educational resources, and these are especially good for folks who are new to the review of OGE Forms 450. This is a page on the Institute for Ethics and Government website. It's the OGE Form 450 Review Curriculum. And here we've tried to bring together all of the resources that you need in order to review an OGE Form 450. So we have job aids, we have descriptions and courses that help you understand the underlying laws and regulations, and a number of opportunities to practice reviewing.
As Patrick discussed, the sole purpose of the OGE Form 450 is to prevent conflicts of interest. And as he described earlier, what we're looking for is the nexus between the duties and responsibilities of the filer's position and any financial or other interests that the employee may have that could be affected by the work that they're performing. So one of the first pieces of information that you should have or have some presence of mind about is that first piece, which is what are the duties and responsibilities of the employee's position. So we've given you, as part of the exercise, that piece of information. We've started out by giving you an agency profile so that you have some sensibility about what the Occupational Safety Office Laboratory Safety Division does. And we've given you a sense of their mission, which is basically they're a rulemaking body, which they provide guidance as well about laboratory safety for personnel. In addition, we've also given you, and on the next slide, you'll see the employee profile. Now here we're talking more discreetly about what your employee is actually going to be doing by way of duties and responsibilities. And we know that we've given this to you, and quite often this is the piece of information that you may very well be missing. But I think it's important to have at least some general sensibility when you start your review or before you start your review about what the potential universe of conflicts might be. So if we look at Mahendra Patel's job duties, we see that as the director of lab safety, he has some responsibility for overseeing safety inspectors and technicians. So that's an enforcement type of responsibility. He is responsible for making regulatory recommendations and policy changes, as well as contributing to proposed rulemakings on lab safety and training requirements. He also serves on the OSO's Laboratory Safety Advisory Committee. And this would be something that would be especially important, I think, because as we describe in the next paragraph, this advisory committee is comprised of participants who are from non-federal entities like academic institutions and private clinics and public health organizations. So it's important to have those kinds of pieces of information sort of front of mind before you actually begin the review of your confidential financial disclosure form, so that things may jump out at you. You might be able to red flag things more easily because you have a sensibility about the types of entities that could create a potential conflict between your employees' duties or with your employees' duties. So as a general proposition, if you don't have a lot of specific information about what your employee does, you might want to at least try to think about generally sort of the types of particular matters that the employee is likely to be engaged in. For our director, if you think along the lines of specific party matters, we know that he's going to be responsible for overseeing inspections. That may also include investigations. Oftentimes, these types of organizations have grant-making functions and grant-making responsibilities. So we might be thinking along those lines, like who would be a potential grantee? Certainly, all these types of organizations have contracting and procurement. So we might want to have available who are the likely sources, vendors, and sources of contracting for the laboratories. And in addition, scientific organizations, research organizations in particular, tend to engage in cooperative research and development agreements. So the acronym is CRADAs. And quite often this is with university research facilities. So that's another possibility. We know that it's a standard setting function that the laboratory has and that the director has. And so we know that matters of general applicability are going to include things like policies, rulemakings, and regulations. And because they're matters of general applicability, the universe of entities that could be affected by those types of matters is perforce much larger than a specific party matter. So again, be thinking about who all could be affected by the duties and responsibilities of your agency generally, and also of your employee in particular. So that brings us to the next slide of things to think about, which is, and in our particular case, who are the stakeholders? Who are the people? Who are the organizations? What types of organizations are likely to be affected by the work of our agency, by the work of this employee? And so we're looking at federal laboratories, as well as other private research and clinical laboratories. Those are typically going to be associated with hospitals and universities or healthcare related companies. For purposes of contracting and vending, we're going to be looking at laboratory equipment and supply manufacturers. Also, training functions like lab safety education and training programs would certainly be also something that could be affected by the standard setting body. And finally, professional associations and societies that clearly have an interest in the standards setting of the lab safety division. So now that we've thought about and have in our head a little bit an idea of the duties and responsibilities of the position, now we need to jump into the OG Form 450, because it's in the OG Form 450 where we're going to get the other piece that we need for our nexus test, which is what are the financial interests or holdings or positions that the employee holds that may or may not be affected or have a relationship to the employee's responsibilities. So the cover page of our confidential financial disclosure report for our filer indicates that, again, he's the director of laboratory safety in the laboratory safety division of the Occupational Safety Office. It also indicates that he's an annual filer. So this is an annual report. And it's important to think about this from the standpoint that that tells you that you should have at least one other report on file for this filer. And as Patrick talked about earlier, the importance of documenting, the importance of taking reviewer notes, the importance of getting additional information or asking questions. Having a record of all of that is going to assist you annually each time you're doing a de novo review, basically, of this employee's holdings and interests and positions. So if you have some questions on the current report, it may very well be that the answer to those questions, particularly any substantive determinations that may have been made about positions that were held or assets that were held, the answers to those are going to lie in the prior review and the notes and documents that have been retained with respect to that prior review. Now, just as a point here about filing status, I just want to note that had our filer been a new entrant filer, we definitely would have wanted to see the new entrant date of appointment. We would have wanted to go back to the filer for that, because the date of appointment is the triggering date for the 30-day filing requirement. So a new entrant filer has to file their new entrant report within 30 days of their date of appointment. So the next section of this report is really where we get a glimpse into what we should expect to see on the report. Here, your filer is required to indicate by either indicating yes or no for each part of the form, whether or not you should expect to see something reported on that section of the report. So our filer has said for parts 1, 3, 4, and 5, they've answered yes, which means we should, when we look at the report, see something indicated in those parts. We're going to come back to part 5 later on to discuss part 5 because he's indicated yes for part 5, and that is the one part where he has actually not disclosed anything. So we're going to be following up on that when we get to part 5. But we do have something disclosed on parts 1, 3, and 4. Now, quickly for part 2, I just want to indicate the fact that our filer has said no. It never ever hurts to go back and confirm with the filer that when they said no, they meant no. But I would say that more often than not, when someone indicates no on part 2, that will be correct because the filing requirements for liabilities in part 2 is a universe that is very circumscribed. You do not have to report, I repeat, you do not have to report common types of liabilities such as mortgages on a personal residence, student loans, credit card debt, other types of bank loans, if they come from a financial institution and they're on terms that are generally available to the public. So that's going to be the majority of liabilities that most people hold, and those types of liabilities are not going to be reportable. So don't be surprised and don't feel that you necessarily have to always go back and confirm that no means no in part 2, because there are actually not very many liabilities that are reportable on part 2. So if we go to the final thing, if we go to the next slide, we'll see that the employee is responsible, obviously, for signing and dating the report. And it's really important that you make sure that they have done this because here the employee is certifying that everything that they've disclosed on the form, that the statements are true, complete, and correct to the best of the employee's knowledge. So now we're going to jump into the report. We're going to actually look at what our filer has disclosed. And in part 1 for assets and income, what we're expecting to see in assets and income are outside earned income, both for the employee and for the spouse. So we're looking for sources of outside earned income. And this is an area where there is notoriously underreporting, not necessarily willful, but if you don't see spousal employment or spousal holdings, that is quite often something that employees just neglect to disclose because they're unaware that they have to. So you should expect to see employment interests and assets both for the employee and for the employee's spouse. So let's start by looking at the first asset that's listed on the report, or the first source of income on the report, and it's BioRaft Digital Lab Risk Management, and he indicates that it is no longer held. So what is it that we want to ask ourselves about this? Well, the list of questions that we want to begin with, and these are going to be sort of a consistent theme throughout the review of your form, is first of all, what is the interest? We can't possibly do a conflict of interest analysis if we don't know what the nature of the interest is. So we want to know what is this interest, both what is BioRaft, but we also want to know what type of interest is it? Is this a source of earned income? Is this an asset that's held for investment purposes? Like what is this to the filer? We want to find out who held it and confirm that it is actually no longer held. And most importantly, we want to answer the question for ourselves. Okay, so is there any likelihood of overlap, any kind of connection or nexus between this interest and the employee's duties? So on the next slide, we're showing you that we went out to the internet, and if you had gone out to the internet to look up BioRaft, you should have found their website. And actually, the description for BioRaft on their website is pretty oblique. So the definition or the description that our filer gave us is actually probably as good as we're going to get. Effectively, it's a software risk mitigating risk and achieving compliance software framework and a compliance management system. And I think the most important thing is to know that it is a system that is geared toward improving lab safety. So we know as a very basic, from the very basic description, that we definitely have a relationship here. This is a digital risk mitigation solution for lab safety issues. I think the other thing that's important is that it has a business unit that addresses government. So it's an organization that clearly does business with the government. So again, another pointer that we do have some sort of relationship between this entity and our employees' duties. Now, so to figure out better like what this is, the OG Form 450 really has to be read a little bit like a storybook. I know that reviewers and filers sometimes get frustrated because there seems to be a redundancy of reporting across the report from part to part. And this is an instance where that redundancy of reporting is really helpful. So when you go to part 3 of the report and we look at the outside positions on the report, you'll see I have highlighted here, he tells us what BioRaft represents. It is a source of outside earned income. He indicates still that it's no longer held, but it appears that our filer has served as a consultant for BioRaft. And then if we look at, at part 3, we have to ask ourselves, okay, so now we know it's a consultancy. Now we know evidently it's no longer held. And we know that BioRaft seems to relate to the employee's duties. So what are the questions we need to ask? What are the things we need to find out in order to ascertain whether or not there's any ethical concerns with the employee having held this consultancy? The first thing is, was this reported on a prior report? Because if this has already been vetted, if this was actually screened in the filer's last report, then if you go back to those review notes, you should be able to find out whether and to what extent this presented a conflict and whether or not the employee had any recusal requirements or other remedial things that they were asked to engage in. And we want to find out if the employee actually sought and received ethics guidance with respect to this. If they did, it should have involved the following answers to the following questions. Did the consulting service relate to the employee's duties? Is the organization a prohibited source or vendor? And did the consultancy involve representational services? And I want to unpack this bullet point a little bit. First, the consulting services relate to the employee's duties. Here we're talking about relationship to duties in a number of ways, one of which is just the nature of the kind of work that the employee does for the government and the nature of the work that they were doing for the consulting group. Was there some sort of overlap or relationship between those two things? So we're looking at an actual close relationship between the duties performed for the government and in the consulting arrangement. Concerns that we have with that are, among other things, just basic use of public office for private gain. Was this employee effectively engaging in services that were making use of non-public information? Was it because of the employee's current position that the consulting arrangement was even offered to the employee? So we're looking at broad considerations like that. Is the organization a prohibited source or vendor, which reaches to, if it is a prohibited source, if it is a vendor for the laboratory, did this employee have interactions with this entity in the course of doing their job as a director of lab safety? If it's a prohibited source for the agency, if it's a contractor or a vendor for labs, again, is it an organization that he could affect in the performance of his duties? And then ultimately, did the consultancy involve any representational services? And we ask this question because there's a separate criminal statute, 18 U.S.C. Section 205, which reaches to an employee serving as an agent or otherwise representing third parties in matters before the government. So I think that anytime we're dealing with a consultancy type of outside activity, it's always advisable to ascertain whether or not there's any contemplation of the employee providing any kind of representational services on behalf of their outside client, to make sure that they're not engaging in any prohibited communications back to the government in connection with that service. So reaching now to the 208 and impartiality types of concerns. we would want to know if there was any kind of a 208 potential conflict of interest, or certainly with impartiality considerations. During the performance of the consultancy, was the employee subject to any recusals, and did they commit to them, and did they actually perform or honor them? Um, and those are all sort of a look back, like, did these things actually occur during the last year? But presuming that all of that is copacetic, everything's good and everything's fine, we would still have to ask ourselves, with respect to the current situation, the employee no longer holds the position. We would still have to ask ourselves, okay, does the employee have any duties that could be affected, that could affect this outside organization? Or if they do, then does the employee currently have or currently need an impartiality recusal? And if they're negotiating, or if they have an arrangement for prospective consultancy with this organization or any other organization, then there actually would have a continuing 208 recusal obligation. So when we look at part 4, if we go to the next slide and we look at part 4, we'll see on part 4, this is agreements and arrangements. And this is where we'd want to see if the employee had a continuing understanding or a continuing arrangement for this consultancy or some other consultancy, and the employee doesn't list anything. But I think it's really incumbent to go back and make sure that, yeah, the current consultancy, they no longer hold, but make sure that if they have begun any sort of negotiations for a future consulting arrangement, we would want to see it on part 4, agreements and arrangements, because as I said in the previous slide, that would create for them a potential 208 conflict of interest that might require their recusal from certain matters. So now, if Patrick, you want to take us to the next asset?
Absolutely. So that the next item reported on the form is Johns Hopkins University, and we have an indication that this is a spouse's employer. This employee has done us a lot of favors here by indicating that this is an employment type relationship, that it's held by his spouse, and we have the name of the employer, Johns Hopkins Hospital. And if we think back to the agency profile and the employee profile and our list of stakeholders, we'll note that hospitals and academic institutions were among the stakeholders of our organization. So we at least facially have a nexus. So we're going to want to ask some questions. With the spouse's employment interest, we're interested in a few things. I'm going to start with the last question first. Does the spouse have any pension or retirement interests from the university? And especially with private sector employment, there are very often other kinds of benefits that go unreported, like a retirement plan, maybe stock holdings, shares. So if it's the first time you're seeing a spouse's employer reported on a 450, you definitely want to go back and ask, do they have any other attendant benefits? Because you may need to analyze those separately for a potential for conflict of interest. So the authority we're most concerned with spouses' employment are 18 U.S.C. Section 208 and 5 CFR 2635-502. And it really depends on the nature of the nexus. So under 208, if all we have is a spouse's employment arrangement, the financial interest that's imputed to the filer is the spouse's financial interest. And the spouse's financial interest in a pure employment, so a no equity situation, is the continued receipt of compensation and continued employment at the level of compensation he or she enjoys. So some of the things we're going to want to know is, what is the spouse's position? Because if that position is in some ways contingent upon our agency's work, we could have a potential problem. Is the spouse's employment work related to laboratory work? Is this an area where we might be engaged in oversight activities or inspections or investigations of the spouse's workplace? Because that could be a more significant nexus that could cause potential for conflict. Is the spouse's employer affected by the work the agency or employee performs? And I think this is a very important question. Is it possible that our filer could have a direct and predictable effect on the continued employment or on the nature of employment of the spouse, because if it is, there's a potential for an 18 U.S.C. Section 208 conflict. And even if there's not a financial interest, we could also want to think about the potential for an appearance concern, because our filer does have a covered relationship under Subpart E of the standards with his spouse's employer. So we may want to put in place a recusal here to make sure that our filer is not participating in matters that would affect his spouse's continued employment or involve his spouse's employer. So that brings us to the next entry on the form, which is IRA Vanguard Healthcare ETF. And again, our filer has done us a big favor. Oftentimes with defined contribution plans like IRAs, 401ks, 403bs, filers will give us the account, but they won't tell us what is within the account. And when we're analyzing these for conflicts of interest, we're only concerned with the underlying holdings. So that it's a tax-deferred account doesn't really help us identify conflicts of interest. What does help us is to know what's held within the tax-deferred account. So in this case, our filer has indicated that what is in the account is the Vanguard Healthcare Exchange Traded Fund. So when we see a fund, some of the questions we need to ask are, is it a mutual fund? So the threshold question is, does it meet the definition of mutual fund? And this is increasingly important because something we've been seeing a lot of lately are managed accounts, which are things that look like funds but are actually accounts held directly for the employee. So if you see something and you can't decide if it's a fund or a managed account when you go look it up online, you're going to have to go back to the filer and find out. The next question is whether it's diversified or sector. Diversified funds do not need to be reported on the OG Form 450, and that's not just a reporting requirement, it's because they're exempt from coverage under 18 U.S.C. Section 208. Sector funds are not. We do have a de minimis exemption in 5 CFR 2640 for sector funds, but we're going to have to find out a second question, and that question is, how much is the fund valued if we have a nexus and if it is indeed a sector fund? So that's sort of our third question here. If it's a sector fund, does it conflict? And in this case, it's a healthcare fund, so it seems that there is a nexus between this fund and the work of our organization. So at least facially, there is a nexus. So we're going to probably want to find out first whether it's a sector fund or a diversified fund. And if we find out it's a sector fund, we're going to need to find out what the value is so that we can find out and determine if it qualifies for one of the de minimis exemptions at 5 CFR 2640. So whenever you see one of these, this should be your general process. Is it a fund? Basically confirm it's not an account. Is it diversified or sector? If it's sector, is there a conflict? And if there's a potential nexus, is there an exemption we could rely upon? So here we have a little information about the fund. This is the investment strategy, and this is how we determine if a fund is indeed a sector or diversified fund. And what we're looking for is the stated policy of the fund. Does the fund say it invests in a single industry, in the bonds of a single state, or one country outside of the United States? So if we have a stated policy of focusing in one of those categories, we know we have a sector fund. And here it looks like we probably do. We see that they have an emphasis on buying healthcare stocks, as we would expect from the name of the fund. But sometimes it can be a little bit difficult to find out if something is indeed a sector fund or if it's diversified, for example, defining a single industry. So OG has issued some guidance, and I'd encourage you to keep this this diagram with your copy of the Confidential Financial Disclosure Reviewer's Guide, because it's very helpful in determining what is and is not a diversified versus sector fund. And that's diagram 00-030. And so it helps us to kind of understand our basic approach. So we're looking for relatedness and overlapping interests in the members of the sector that we see in the fund's description. So we're looking for the types of companies to be part of one industry or business sector. And one of the things we look to find out if this is true is if they share a common regulatory environment, or if government decisions affecting one type of company would be expected to affect the other, given their independence, interdependence, or competition with each other. So here it seems that that's probably the case with this fund. And indeed, we have some particular guidance later on in this advisory dealing with healthcare sector funds. And it seems that if we take a close look at this guidance, that we will find we're probably dealing with a sector fund. So we're going to want to go to that fourth step in our process, which is to ask our filer, what is the value of this holding, so that we can determine whether or not that holding qualifies for one of the de minimis exemptions at 5 CFR 2640. So that's your general process. Is it a fund? Make sure it's not an account. Is it diversified, or is it a sector fund? If it's a sector fund, is there a nexus? If there's a nexus, does an exemption apply? And if you follow those steps, you'll be well prepared to review and analyze potential conflicts arising from mutual funds.
Okay, so we've come to our final holding that's listed on part 1, and it's the American Chemical Society. And again, as draft entry, we're going to want to ask effectively the same questions, which is, what is the nature of this interest? Who holds it? And then, generally speaking, is there any sort of nexus? Is there any sort of connection between this organization and the employee's duties? So on this slide, you'll see I pulled up a screenshot of the American Chemical Society. Now, the American Chemical Society is a professional society. And so as a general proposition, they are going to have interests in the laboratory safety. But if you look on their site, I actually found a discrete and specifically articulated interest in chemical and laboratory safety. And it indicates here that the American Chemical Society advocates for the safe practice of chemistry across disciplines. In every organization, we engage with like-minded professionals and entities to provide tools to foster a culture of safety in your classroom, campus, or lab. So they actually have a chemical and laboratory safety functionality. So clearly, it's something that there is some apparent work that our employee performs. So as was the case before, we have to use other parts of the form to help us inform what we're seeing on part 1. So if we look at part 3, as we have here on this slide, for outside positions, we see he does list the American Chemical Society as a position, and he indicates that he is an instructor with this professional society. If we further, looking on the next slide, if we look at part 4, he further gives us information about his agreements and arrangements with the American Chemical Society. He lists that he has an agreement to teach a laboratory safety course in April of 2021, and that he entered this agreement in October of 2020. So what are some questions that we have about this? It would appear from part 3 that the employee is currently employed by the American Chemical Society because he lists it as a position. And it appears as if he's already received compensation from them because he lists them on part 1. And so we have to ask ourselves, is he currently an employee? What is his status vis-a-vis the American Chemical Society? And again, as was the case with BioRaft, do we have any evidence that he already sought and received ethics guidance with respect to whatever position he has encumbered with them prior to his submitting this year's annual report? Obviously, we're going to want to know what services is the employee providing as an instructor, and to whom is he providing the instruction. So one of the questions we would want to ask with respect to these services as instructor is, does this qualify as teaching? Presumably it would. When you think of instructor, I think of it being a teaching position. Because we do have the restrictions in the standards of conduct at 5 CFR 2635.807. These restrictions reach to compensation for teaching, speaking, or writing that relates to the employee's official duties. And there are a variety of ways that that teaching, speaking, and writing can relate to an employee's official duties. Certainly, the subject matter of the teaching is one way that the teaching could be related. But there are also other definitions, such as whether or not the entity that is providing the compensation has interests that could be substantially affected by the performance or non-performance of the employee's duties. So, for example, does the employee have the ability to substantially affect the interests of the American Chemical Society? That would be another relatedness test for purposes of the restrictions at 807. Now, as many of you may be familiar with, there is an exception for teaching in 807 that permits, under certain circumstances, an employee to teach a course that's related to their duties. But the stipulations are that the course has to be part of the regularly established curriculum of an institution of higher education, an elementary school, a secondary school, or a program of education or training that's sponsored and funded by the federal government or by a state or local government. The American Chemical Society is not, to my knowledge, an institution of higher education, and presumably it would not be a program of education or training that was sponsored and funded by the federal government or a state or local government. So 807 might be a real concern for our employee if the instruction that they're providing is in any way related to their official duties. We would want to know whether or not the American Chemical Society was a prohibited source for our organization, because we would want our employee to be recused from any matters that would involve or affect the American Chemical Society. So, for example, if the American Chemical Society regularly sponsors conferences and events to which it includes government organizations, our employee, for example, would not be permitted to approve that an employee's participation in an American Chemical Society sponsored conference and approve the payment of a fee, a conference fee, or some other source of financial interest that the American Chemical Society would have. So that would be an instance where the interests of the American Chemical Society could be affected by our employees' official duties. So as a general proposition, we need to know whether and to what extent the American Chemical Society could be affected by the employee's duties, but most particularly, we're going to want to make sure that if the employee is receiving compensation for engaging in teaching for the American Chemical Society, that they're doing so in compliance with the standards of conduct, particularly 2635.807.
So that brings us to the last part of the form, part 5. And if you recall from earlier, we noted on the cover page that our filer has indicated that there were reportable gifts, but now we have a bit of a conflict, which suggests that there are no actual gifts reported on the form. So this is one place where keeping good records might help us quite a lot. We could go back into our notes, and we may learn that, in fact, our filer had received advice about gifts, and we could go back to them and ask them about specific instances in which they've received gift advice. We might also, if we don't have any such records, go back and ask particularly about gifts related to BioRaft or the American Chemical Society. And the reason for that is that's typically where we see gifts that are reportable are associated with outside activity. So those may be travel or events, invitations, things like that. So that might be a place to begin your inquiry with the employee, because you are going to have to determine definitively which is correct. Is the cover page of the form correct, or is part 5 correct? And if the cover page is correct and there are reportable gifts, you'll want to analyze those under subpart B of the standards to make sure that they were properly accepted. And if not, you may have to ask the employee to take some remedial action. So I think Cheryl's going to take us through to the end here.
Yes, absolutely. So to recap, the primary objective of our exercise today was to assist you in issue spotting based on information that you have, both about the filer's duties and the information that the filer provides for you on their form. Um, we would do that because we want to emphasize the importance of your substantive review and to reinforce the notion that anytime you're engaging in any type of identification of actual or potential conflicts of interest or other ethics concerns, it's extremely important that you reduce those observations and those analyses to writing, that you take copious reviewers' notes, that you know what kinds of questions to ask filers about information that's disclosed on the form to better assist you in making these substantive reviews, and that you know what kind of information to request of filers. Once you've made those substantive determinations, for example, we disclosed various things on the form that we thought might be somewhat problematic or that certainly were worth following up on. And whenever you do determine, if you were to determine that there was an actual or potential conflict of interest, you should, again, reduce those to some sort of cautionary memo that you issue to the filer, giving them a heads up about things that you identified. Or if you actually are requiring the filer to do something as a result of something you found on the form, you may want to consider issuing them an ethics agreement where they, again, agree in writing to commit to the remedial steps that you're requiring of them. Understanding at the end of the day, you cannot sign and date the report as the certifier until such time as anything that you've identified on the form that presents an actual or potential conflict has in some way, shape, or form been remediated. We know that that the substantive review is the critical part of the review, but we also note that there are technical aspects to the review, and that it's important for you to have a resource where that it will assist you in helping you to identify not only what you're seeing on the report, but maybe better know what you should be seeing on the report in the way of technical disclosure. So again, we advocate very strongly that you make the OGE Form 450 review guide the standard resource that you use for all purposes, and that if you are not currently using it, that you become very familiar with it, because it covers all of the technical aspects of filing, as well as programmatic aspects for how you should run your 450 review system. We encourage you, if you have any questions about today's broadcast or generally about 450 filing as you're engaging in your 450 review season, that you contact your OGE desk officer. It's one of the best resources that OGE has to offer you by way of direct assistance. We've also provided you on our website, with respect to today's exercise, we've given you an answer key, as it were, to the debrief that we gave you today. So we hope that that you found today helpful. And again, we encourage you to use all of the resources that are available in the Institute for Ethics in Government. And we thank you very much for your time.